Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the January garden checklist video. I do one of these each month for what we have going on here in our garden in Raleigh, North Carolina, Zone 7B. If you're in a colder zone, like 5 or 6, these things you might be doing, several weeks behind us, but they're still will apply to you as well. Not a lot of people think about planting necessarily in January, but here in the South, the soil's completely workable. And as long as the plant is hardy in your area, like you're not pushing the boundaries on it, you're not trying to grow something that's barely hardy in your area, or it came out of a greenhouse. So if it came out of a greenhouse, has lots of new growth on it, that's probably not something I'd put in the ground in January. But if it's something that's been outside, like this maple has been outside all winter long, it's acclimated to the temperatures that we have, it's right in line with everything else that's in the ground right now, I definitely would put it in the ground. And it's actually better off in the ground than it would be in this container. This, with the roots exposed to the actual air temperatures out here. This plastic's not offering any protection to those roots really. It's actually better off in the ground. So keep that in mind. This Miss Lemon Abelia, same thing. Got one in the ground back here. Again, this container's been out all winter. Hasn't been protected so much that it's like covered in new growth or anything like that. So those things can definitely go in the ground. The other things, we've got pansies and snapdragons, and we had a pretty bad cold snap there at the end of December. I think most of you probably went through that same thing around Christmas time. My snapdragons, pansies, dianthus don't look as good as they normally do. If there's some available out in the world, in the box stores or garden centers, wherever, you can replace some of those. We actually had some rabbit, do some work on ours, and then severe cold hit them. And so there's a spot here or there that we could plug a few back in. I think they're on their way back, and we're going to give them a little bit of organic fertilizer here in the next week or two, and hope that they're going to come back out. But if they don't, there should still be some available in January to plant. The other thing is bare root roses, bare root trees. Those things either ordered online or maybe through your garden center become available toward the end of the month, and it's a great time to get those things in the ground. One of the things I'm thinking about planting during the winter time is things with winter interest, things that actually look good this time of year. We're going to have some upcoming videos from several different places with some things that look good during the winter time. Those are upcoming, and I'm sure it will include some of the things that are around me now, like this Florida Sunshine Alyssium with this great gold color here. We're filming this December 30th, so you can see how beautiful that is. There's a cast iron plant here looking great, Alyssium in the background, Mahonia that's still blooming in the foreground, and just a few days ago had 11 degrees on it, and it's still full of flowers. Bees will be on it this afternoon. It's supposed to be like 60 today, so it'll have bees visiting it. So this is one of the things we're looking around for. Camellia japonicas, although this early wonder camellia, all the open flowers on it, if I can pull this off, got absolutely destroyed, nuked basically during the cold, but all the flower buds that are on it are still viable. They weren't damaged at all. So it will just, when it warms back up, just start to open some new flowers on it. So we are out looking for things that can add winter interest to the garden this time of year. So moving over to the very sad vegetable garden, we had just had 11 degrees. It didn't come back above freezing for 3 days. That pretty much ended our fall vegetable garden, except for there is some kale and a few other really, really rugged winter crops in here, and they'll actually start to put on some growth again. So we'll leave a couple of these things up. Some of the other things like the lettuce was definitely more sensitive to that type of cold, and it's gone now. We'll be starting seeds indoors toward the end of January for another crop of our cool season vegetables and some peas. We'll put the peas directly in the ground. You definitely want to be acquiring seed right now. So whether we're talking about flower seeds for the, to plant in other areas, throughout your landscape, whatever you're starting from seed, you want to acquire it sooner the better, just because there's been a bit of a shortage in seed, and you may not get the exact thing that you want if you're not ordering them sooner than later. You can get a vegetable planting guide for your area online. So the best way it's hard for me in Zone 7B in Raleigh to tell you when to start your peppers, or when to start your lettuce. You can find a guide that's specific for your area. So if you'll search your city and vegetable planting guide, I guarantee you there's one online that will tell you when either you should be starting something from seed that you'll be transplant outside later, like you would start it inside, transplant it outside, or start it in a greenhouse, whatever, or you would direct seed it into the ground. So for us, here in Raleigh, toward the end of January, we'll start our another round of cool season crops. That could be lettuce, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, peas, bok choy, kohlrabi, beets, so on and so forth. Some of those things can be started from seed in the house toward the end of January. Some of it gets direct seeded a little bit later. The packet of seed will tell you the approximate days that if you're starting it from seed to transplant outside, how long that takes. So what we'll want to do is put our cool season stuff back in the ground somewhere around the 1st of March. So if we start them right at the end of January, we can get them in the ground the 1st of March, and then we'll be ready to cover them. So March, April, May, we'll get cool season vegetables out of here. Sometime about the time we're putting cool season vegetables back in here, we'll be starting our summer vegetables inside. It's right behind these. And these will grow, we'll be picking things out of here, and then sometime toward the end of April, those summer crops will go into these cool season crops. And the growth we get on those summer things can help shade some of these cool season things from the heat, hopefully extend the season. We're picking lettuce a little bit longer. So we have a plan. We have a plan in place. That's how we do it. But get a guide for your area, and then you'll know if you're going to direct seed it into the ground, when to do that. If you're going to start it in the house, which was what we do and what you'll see on the channel, we'll do that. So we're going to go in here, clean out the things that are definitely done for, leave the kale, which has definitely survived, looks rough but has survived, clean it up, and then we'll cover it with either compost, some sort of bagged humus. We've got some wood chips over here. I'm not going to cover it in wood chips because they won't have time to break down before our next crop. So what we'll do is we can put a new layer of compost on this to keep it covered, keep weeds from going crazy in it. That can be leaves. You can use leaves, and then you can rake those leaves out of the way when you plant your new things into the ground, or just pull it back a little bit and plant your new things into the ground. And then in between those rows, we'll use our wood chips, and the wood chips will will just become the paths in the garden, and they'll break down and become compost over some period of time. But that's our process. Sometime toward the end of January, we're going to start our cool season seed. Sometime toward the beginning of March, we'll start our summer seed, and cool season stuff will go right back in here in about 60 days from the day you're watching this video. And in the meantime, I want to protect this soil, all the living things that we've created here in our organic garden. I want to make sure the soil's covered and protected until we replant. So we had quite a few things covered this past week during that big freeze that we had. And it wasn't so much the temperature. The temperature here wasn't actually below normal, but it got there really quickly, and not everything was asleep. And we have a few marginal things out here, things that we're pushing the boundaries on, that we had some covers on. So be prepared. We'll definitely be prepared to throw the covers back on. We're going to have another snap like that, I'm sure, during the winter. I think less things will need to be covered the next round because now they're more asleep than they were, and they just had not everything had gotten to sleep. So that's one thing we're thinking about when we get our cool season vegetables back in the ground over there in the beginning of March. I know this is a January video, but we do plan for having the ability to cover them, because there's still about 6 or 8 weeks of really cold temperatures potentially from the time we put that lettuce back in the ground until our average last frost date sometime around about mid-April. The other thing about the vegetable garden back over there is planning. It's easy to go overboard when you're buying seed, when you're starting seed, it's easy to end up with 10 times more plants than you actually have space for. So we do a bit of planning over there for, how many rows we can have, how many actual plants we can put in the ground, so that we're not starting a crazy number of seeds. The other thing with seed for this month is we do go through and look right here at the beginning of January. Once our seeds are about 2 years old, we typically will we'll dispose of them and not. It's not to say that all seed isn't viable, but you do get less germination, sometimes less vigor in the plants with seed that's a couple years old. So we will go through and cull out some of our seed. Maintenance for the month of January in the garden. Toward the end of January, we are going to mulch this landscape. I think it's a really good time to do it. Sometime, let's say late January, anytime during February, definitely by the middle of March. And the reason for that is we get two types of weeds coming up. We have our cool season weeds like chickweed and henbit, which have pretty much already germinated everywhere. You're not necessarily seeing it, but they've come up. They'll go absolutely wild if given a chance, and you see those white flowers and those little purple flowers in the beginning of March every year. That's what that is. And so we want to get a cap on those things, hopefully, make sure that they're not taking over the garden and seeding themselves everywhere. And then sometime toward the middle of March here in our area in Raleigh, a little later in colder areas, the soil temperature warms up to the point where our summer weeds start to germinate. Maybe they don't put on a lot of growth, but they germinate and they start to build root system so that later in the summer they can just take over your garden, and that can be things like crabgrass, Johnson grass, those kinds of things. And so by putting that mulch cap on right before those two events happen, we can prevent a lot of it. You can't prevent all your weeds. You're going to have weeding, no way to prevent it, but that's a good timing to get your mulch down sometime between now and when you're watching this video and the beginning of March. They're really just a couple basic maintenance things to do out here, and then I'll tell you some things not to do in the garden quite yet. One is definitely to get the leaves off of your turf. That one seems pretty obvious. The other one is our pansies don't really like to have these leaves sitting on them, and so despite the fact that we leave our leaves on the ground out here and don't dispose of them, the mulch is just going to go right over our leaves. We will go through here just gently with a rake and get the leaves off of the top of the pansies, the snapdragons, the dianthus. That black compost that those are planted in will warm up quite a bit more with the sun directly on that and not on the leaves. Also, on warmer days could have snails and slugs as we get a little later into the season, and I definitely don't want those around my pansies. I already have rabbit issues and cold issues. Again, we're going to fertilize those, but we're not going to fertilize anything else in the garden until around the middle of February or so, which is probably even still a little bit earlier than other people would. I tend to do that fertilizing video a couple weeks early just so people can see how I go about fertilizing in this garden, which is just throwing out some organic fertilizer once a year. The rest of the fertilizing that's happening in this garden is just mulch. The mulch breaking down and supplying nutrients, and the leaves off the plants dropping down, supplying nutrients, and even the pieces that we prune off the plants being dropped down to the ground and allowing them to become nutrients for our plants as well. One other thing I'll do with the leaves, other than getting them off the lawn and getting them off the pansies, is I'll go through my shrubs and just try to knock most of them off of the shrubs. I'm not going to do this to the point that I'm beating the plants up, but if there's a few leaves I can get here and there, I'll just walk through the garden once a week. All I'm doing is getting the leaves down to the ground, which is where they're trying to get to anyway. And then again, we're going to put a mulch cap across that. It's really much easier to edge this time of year. So if you need to edge around your turf, if you're creating new beds, there's no easier time than January and early February to get the old grass out if you're going to hand dig it out. Just because the ground is softer, it tends to be wetter. You don't really have to do very much watering this time of year unless you're in an area that just hasn't gotten rainfall for whatever reason, but it's actually quite wet here. It stayed locked up in ice for a few days, but the water's here. As soon as it thawed out, it's actually almost quite wet out here at this point. So we don't have to do any watering on the ground, and it's easier to work. And so some of those construction jobs that you might be doing, if you were going to build a retaining wall and you wanted to go ahead and dig the footer out, this would be a great time of year to do that. If you're going to put in a patio and you need to dig that out, be a great time, again, edging, all of those kinds of things. Any big holes you got to dig. The only watering we'll think about is possibly containers, just keeping an eye on them. They're more likely to dry out than anything else in the garden. If you have container plants that have synthetic fertilizer in them, and that might be some sort of prill fertilizer, Holly's going to come across the scene. One of her friends just ran by the gate out here. If you have a synthetic fertilizer in the container, you might want to take a water hose once or twice during the winter and flush the nutrients out of that pot, because they actually build up in the container. So that pretty much covers all the maintenance. I'm taking leaves off the lawn, taking leaves off the pansies, knocking leaves off the shrubs. If there's any edging to do, we'll mulch later in the month. We'll fertilize the pansies sooner than later. We probably won't fertilize anything else in the garden until February. And we also won't do any of our pruning until February. We had some damage from that recent freeze, and so I don't know how bad the damage is. It takes a little while sometimes for it to really show up. And so I may not have to prune the plants back as hard as I think I do, or I may have to really, take off a lot of dead material. I'm going to make those decisions later in February. I'll talk about that more in the February to-do video, and I'll know more about the damage that I have in this garden at that point, which is not that much, I don't think, but some things will look worse over the next week or two. Just that's the way it happens. There'll be some video content toward the end of January, during February and March, on pruning. I want to show how to prune things and still have them look natural and not have to prune them into little round balls every time you prune them. So I want to show that off. You need to know what you have before you prune it, because some of this stuff blooms in the early spring. And if you're pruning it this time of year, you're pruning the flowers off potentially. So knowing what you have is important. But there are some things that can definitely be pruned. If you have a crazy limb on something, you can prune that off whenever you want to. I get that kind of question all the time. If you have crossing limbs, so if you have a tree that has two limbs and they're just sitting there wearing one another out every time the wind blows, those are the kinds of things you want to get off the plant sooner than later and don't really matter. Timing is, if you're protecting the plant, timing is irrelevant. And so if you have, whatever type of plant it is, if you're helping it, then go ahead and do it. Perennial grasses, you can go ahead and prune back toward the end of January. If you want to get those things, it's best to leave the grass up on them as long as possible, but there's a limit to that. At some point, the grass starts to regrow, and then it becomes problematic pruning them back. So toward the end of January, if you want to prune back some of your ornamental grasses, that's fine. Maybe you need to replace your pansies because your dog lays in them, which Holly frequently does. I don't know why. She loves these annual beds everywhere and has no regard for them. So, January, for most folks, they're not going to do a lot of gardening other than some minor maintenance things, which I've talked about. It is a good time to be planting. And going to public gardens, going to places where you might find some, again, winter interest things that are, could help your garden going forward. Other thing I said earlier about ordering seed, I still think that's something that, if you're planning on, and it's fun to shop, if nothing else, one of the funnest parts of gardening is shopping, for sure. So getting those seeds. The other thing that will probably become available before the end of the month is going to be summer bulbs. And so things like elephant ears, dahlias, those kinds of things, you'll start to see them show up at the garden centers and box stores. You can acquire them, but it's way too early to be putting them in the ground, so you acquire them and keep them. If you've dug any of those things up, if you dug up caladiums or elephant ears or dahlias, you might want to go and check on them, depending on how you stored them. Make sure they're not rotting, because that can spread to the other ones, and so some sort of check on those during the winter is a good idea. Our containers that are slightly more marginal, we've got them gathered up together, and they'll just stay here for the rest of the biggest cold threat during the winter time, so we can cover them up if we need to. One thing, this is a good month to be cleaning things, and so if you've got a bird bath to clean, a fountain to clean, all your garden tools, your lawnmower, getting all those things cleaned and ready and prepared so that you're ready to go during the spring. We are also feeding the birds. The birds are an important part of gardening. Having them in the garden, will help reduce all kinds of insect pressures that we have. And so we're feeding them, making sure that they have fresh water to drink, that kind of thing. So there you go. That's what we're doing in our January garden. And I think overall, it's not a whole lot of those things I just said are actually happening in January, just the preparation for them. We will go ahead and edge, again, anything that's related to having to dig in the ground during the thawed times in the winter. It's certainly easier than any other time of the year and less strenuous on you as well. So thank you guys for following along. We'll be back in February with another one of these monthly checklists.